Imagine a quiet alley in the center of Geneva, where between an antique shop and a translation bureau stands an inconspicuous building with weathered facade masonry and a heavy oak door. Shrouded windows do not let in a single ray of light, and outside reigns a sterile grayness, devoid of any fuss. This is not an ordinary bank with queues, consultants, and brochures. There is no nameplate, no license, not even walls in the usual sense. This is the heart of a hidden network where billions of dollars flow in unseen streams, changing the destinies of countries and regimes. Funds came from shadow deals, such as arms supplies to Africa, Asia, and the Middle East. Automatic rifles, airplanes, anti-aircraft systems went through shell companies to neutral states like Cuba or Libya. In return came currencies of various countries, but they did not end up in the state treasury. Instead, money slipped through gray routes to Panama, Cyprus, Liechtenstein, Austria, and back to Switzerland, where it settled in anonymous accounts, not tied to real names. Each such account was supervised by a special employee reporting directly to the center, without uniform, without reports, but with the power to redraw political maps. This system did not arise by chance, and to understand its strength, one must return to its roots, when the world of the Cold War demanded tools that were beyond the reach of ordinary rules. It all began in the 60s when the Soviet Union realized that official channels were too vulnerable for financing secret affairs abroad. Support for pro-communist movements, partisans, underground media, and covert operations required funds that could not be processed through the state budget without the risk of exposure. It was then in the depths of the intelligence structure that the idea of its own financial web was born, completely isolated from external view, not subordinate to either the central bank or the Ministry of Finance. It served only the interests of intelligence possessing connections inaccessible to commercial institutions. Through these channels, it was possible to fund politicians, organize changes of power, support the press, or ensure a quiet life for former agents. Money here was not just stored, it became the architecture of influence, living by laws far from borders and ethics. The system functioned smoothly until the curious began to dig deeper, revealing its scale. By the end of the 80s, dozens, if not hundreds, of offshore companies existing only on paper, with accounts across Europe, Asia, and South America, revolved in its orbit. The chains of these entities intertwined so tightly that tracing them was almost impossible, and registration was done through carefully selected intermediaries with experience in delicate matters. The main nodes were hidden in quiet harbors like Switzerland, Austria, or Luxembourg, where laws protected secrecy as a sacred thing. One such structure, later known by a certain name, served as a facade for millions directed to operations in certain regions. Cash was brought by diplomatic mail, converted and dispersed through a chain for equipment, services, or support for groups. Without audits, without permits, under the cover of foreign sovereignty, but with control from Moscow offices, where schemes more valuable than any military plans were kept. Loss of control meant loss of influence, so operations were entrusted only to proven specialists capable of foreseeing threats and adapting. They managed until the time of changes came, but behind the scenes hid figures that made this machine truly elusive. In narrow circles, these figures were called financial shadows, elite specialists balancing at the intersection of intelligence, banking, and global business. With fictional biographies and foreign documents, they lived for years in Vienna, Zurich, or Luxembourg, posing as independent consultants. They were not known at embassies, their names were hidden even from colleagues, but it was they who orchestrated the most delicate flows, integrated into local circles, made connections with lawyers, influenced bank employees, built legal shields so that everything looked like ordinary business. They collaborated with institutions where confidentiality was valued above all else. Come with a briefcase of cash, say the right words, and an account is opened without names, only with numbers. Registration was carried out through fictitious funds or trading groups with offices in remote corners, like Hong Kong, and nominal managers from remote islands. Real power remained with these shadows, providing instant access to capital anywhere in the world. The entire machine, shell companies, lawyers, logisticians, worked from central offices to distant capitals, all without the knowledge of most leaders, because knowledge weakened protection, But this network did not depend on exchange rates or changes of leaders. It followed its own logic of survival, which made it eternal. While the official world approved budgets in halls and disseminated plans through departments, these shadows created a parallel reality where billions moved without signatures or traces. In that era, two dimensions coexisted: the visible, with its budget articles and balances, and the hidden, where intelligence disposed of funds outside any framework. These flows did not flicker in trade statistics, were not reflected in payments. They resided in a special zone where the value was not profit, but invisibility. Every transfer from a shell account in a European city to an account in Latin America could shift power in an entire country, and an investment in a harmless firm actually fueled supply chains to Africa. The camouflage was masterful: multi-level chains with transfers through Panama to Austria, fictitious purchases in Scandinavia, returns to Lebanon, and cash in Beirut. Documents circulated by diplomatic mail, couriers in civilian clothes with special passports, and contracts disguised as deals for construction or cultural events. Here, politics, trade, and hidden motives intertwined, relying on personal connections and honed paths. The network had no single center. Files were hidden in safes across continents. Codes were known only to a few, allowing millions to be sent without names or to collapse foreign schemes unnoticed. Thus, a structure called the Gray Network was born, with no name on the map, but with a life that adapted to any chaos. When the empire began to tilt, it was this network that stood firm, with assets safely abroad, accessible only to the chosen few, promising to survive any collapse. In 1991, when a vast empire began to crumble into pieces, ministries lost their bearings, the army, control over units and party structures, any clarity of subordination. Chaos covered everything except for one machine: the intelligence financial network, which continued to tick with the same precision. Over the years, it had learned to ignore political storms, as its creators never believed in the eternity of regimes, seeing capital as an eternal resource. From the first days of the 90s, a process began which became one of the largest asset transfers in European history. Funds went not in briefcases, but as digital flows through banks and offshore platforms. First millions, then tens, hundreds. Let's recall an episode in Vienna where assets related to the former intelligence appeared on the deposit account of a Panamanian company. They were identified only by a bank employee who handed the papers to the press, but even then, there were no cases or punishments. Legally, everything was impeccable: registered firms without mention of services, within the norms. The entire web operated on such templates. Dozens of shell entities in Panama, Singapore, Luxembourg, with nominal figures, often unaware. These shells not only stored, but also reflected attacks, leading traces to people who had already left the ranks. After the collapse, many of these shadows moved into entrepreneurship, retaining control due to knowledge of codes and paths. They became the new elites, with invisible starting capital, withdrawn in the shadows of the 80s, now emerging as investments in restaurants, construction projects, and media groups. Not all funds returned. A significant portion lay dormant in Zurich, Geneva, on islands, in Asian repositories, serving as a buffer against chaos and checks. This was a reserve, hidden even from the new government, and if someone tries to find it today, they will encounter a new structure grown on an old foundation, which began behind that oak door in a Swiss back alley. Delving deeper into the history of these flows, one realizes that the network went beyond mere hiding. It transformed into an alternative economic circuit, necessary in an era of deficit, strict currency control, and a closed ruble. Hard currency for foreign affairs was a matter of intelligence survival, but with the growth of success, the system detached itself from the state that spawned it, acquiring its own logic, sometimes contradicting party directives. It happened that officials asked for help with transfers abroad and were refused. Finances were subordinate only to the center. Hundreds of real estate properties accumulated in the arsenal: villas in Spain, apartments in Paris, land in Cyprus, bought through offshore companies, outside diplomatic registries. Agents in transit, defectors, or officers on respite found refuge there, and sometimes properties were rented out, accumulating profits in hidden accounts. The strategy went beyond preservation. The network acquired brokers, insurers, consultants who knew nothing of the real client. They conducted transactions without questions. Key investments were made in projects with no visible connection to the source: hotels, entertainment venues, car dealerships, even ports, where the investor was listed as a London or Singapore firm. But in reality, a specialist under disguise was in charge. Funds circulated through numerous operations, erasing traces, but always according to the rules, with taxes and reports to legitimize and integrate into global turnover. Decades later, these companies evolved, changing owners and names, but their roots went back to blueprints in Moscow safes. It's not worth reducing everything to greed. Initially, it was about survival in a world where adversaries had open funds. And here, a shadow economy loyal to the center was required. Over time, it took on political roles. Through fictitious funds, money went to conferences, movements, unions, changing sentiments in Chile, Greece, Sudan, Indonesia, wherever there was interest. $2 million could go anywhere within a week, without a trace, at a single signal from the center. Leaks rarely happened. Loyalty, codes, and fear replaced contracts, and violation led to isolation. After the collapse, participants dissolved, some into banks, some into diplomacy. But the network lived on in their memory. Western reports in the 90s noted, the visible system is just the tip of the iceberg. The real assets are in the shadows, controlled by economists loyal to security, where only control matters, transcending ideologies. Swiss nodes were particularly attracting attention. Modest firms in Zurich, Basel, Geneva, formally handling taxes for Eastern Europeans, but in reality, money laundering machines. Each rented a tiny office, used the same notaries and banks, turning incoming funds into clean assets. Notaries often had no idea, but secrecy was sacred, and even the global fight against suspicious flows did not break them. They migrated to Liechtenstein or changed their corporate shells. These capitals settled in real estate in London, Paris, Berlin, the French Riviera. Houses and buildings owned by companies whose chains led nowhere, to offshore accounts and dead names. Investments became power capsules, working for decades, impervious to confiscation. By the end of the 80s, the network influenced domestically. It procured banned equipment, computers, software, components, medical equipment, bypassing plans, through clean firms in Hong Kong or Vienna. Payment was made from anonymous accounts with no link to the recipient. This fed secret facilities from listening systems to elite centers. While the party clung to the old model, the shadows invested in the West, opened accounts in America, sent their descendants to London, foreseeing ideas fade, capital is eternal. They survived the collapse without losses, owning foreign infrastructure when the ruble was falling. Retirees received apartments in Vienna or Cannes as gifts from funds. In reality, payment for service and silence. Others advised banks on Eastern European markets, sitting on boards under pseudonyms. Thus, the network mutated into a global market, without symbols, only with control. After the collapse, it gained freedom without the barriers of the Central Committee, legalizing the shadows in an era of chaos. Former cadres took niches in finance and politics, becoming architects of privatization, advising magnates through intermediaries. They formed family offices, siphoned off reserves through Swiss channels, transforming commodity deals into loans and shares. Frozen 70s assets were revived through procedures, with flawless paperwork where statutes of limitations erased questions. This redistributed influence, the structure dissolved into the hands of bankers and lawyers thinking strategically, integrating capital into future power, making it the foundation of a new elite where the line between old and new was erased. The West tried to unravel these capitals in the 90s with investigations into missing party funds and mysterious offshore companies. Newspapers like The Guardian published excerpts about money in Geneva or London, but it all remained speculation, villas bought through Swedish banks or Hungarian intermediaries. The secret was the lack of a center. The network was like a mycelium, with autonomous nodes where the failure of one did not affect others. Algorithms, not trust, with jurisdictions in the BVI, directors from Estonia, banks in Liechtenstein. Transfers were made in person without records, following reconnaissance habits. Services attempted dialogue, but in Russia, archives disappeared. documents were destroyed before the coup. Those who knew lived abroad under new masks, in the logic of silence. Their triumph was their dissolution into funds and clubs, indistinguishable from the norm. In the 2000s, with the rise of technology, the network revived. In the world of transparency, old methods, offshore accounts, trusts, became a shield. When banks introduced checks and states exchanged data, users of these methods adapted instantly, living for decades in paranoia without a trace. They headed consulting firms for young magnates, turning experience into a tool for enrichment. Legal advice from Zurich, trusts from London, beneficiaries with Maltese passports, all for legitimacy. Capital came to light. Purchases of clubs, hotel chains, studios, logistics, appearing transparent but with a core from the 70s. By the 2010s, the line blurred, everything mixed in the global ocean. Analysts tried to map it, but the answer was everywhere, in funds and holdings, inseparable from the norm. Rare findings, strange transactions led to dead ends. Closed firms, lost papers, nominal figures like ordinary workers. An architecture without a center, fragmented, where no one knew everything. Subsequently, capitals became instruments of maneuvering. Loyal media abroad, think tanks, investments in telecom and energy, business on the surface, influence in reality. Cold War money transitioned into the hybrid era, moving like a glacier, invisible and unstoppable. Fragments surface, like a dormant account in Geneva in 2004 with millions of francs in a defunct company, or a building in London in 2011, bought through an Austrian transfer with roots in old connections. Hints, shadows, where the process is more important than the names. This shadow is a weapon, signals without proof, roots without senders, which became algorithms. The system survived its creators, evolving like an organism, integrating into weak economies, offering ways around barriers. New participants, lawyers, bankers, integrate seamlessly, extending its life. Its uniqueness lies in calculation, not ideas, making it immortal. In Russia, traces were erased immediately after the collapse. Archives were destroyed, databases were missing, specialists left clean, settled abroad, or disappeared. The core, people and connections, was enough for adaptation. The new elite grew under their wing. Capital withdrawal, avoiding audits, they became curators without publicity, indirectly influencing parties and laws. Money became an extension of power, a link between eras. By the 2020s, the network merged with global capital, in offices and funds, unrecognizable. Business successes relied on their infrastructure, lessons in camouflage. Paradoxically, capital funded even Western startups or projects of rights through chains of investors, buying access discreetly. Now they are distributed assets with built-in security. Nominals, multi-layered transfers, closed deals. Lawyers do not know their clients. Risks are excluded. Attempts at exposure drown in barriers, secrecy, confidentiality. The system is a symbiont of the economy, circumventing sanctions, changing forms under pressure, integrating crypto and blockchain for new disguises. Transfers are decentralized, assets tokenized, but the principles are old. Fragmentation, where everyone knows a fragment. Leaks, like the Panama Papers, tear the chains instantly. The purpose is not storage, but influence, security for agents, bailout of firms, shifts in negotiations. More effective than centuries-old banks because it was born for survival, not profit. Financial special forces. The fate of assets within the structure. Distributed management through intermediaries, personal handover, like in ancient brotherhoods. Today, in Asian hubs, African projects, European funds with the DNA of discipline and silence. Complete exposure is impossible. Even the storyteller will reveal only a piece. In a transparent world, it is an invisible enigma, living without signals. Over decades, it has changed forms from underground to a network of influence, always one step ahead, without trials or revelations. A mechanism outside of deadlines, markets, lists, diversified in Nigerian oil wells, Singaporean funds, Canadian shares, French vineyards. The principle from the 70s. and account for the case of disappearance. Now, half a century later, in a new world with a code of silence and dispersion, it resembles a legend, exists independently, and analysts forget. Behind the new can be something very old, disguised for invulnerability. It's hard to believe, but the mechanism of silence lives like a timeless ecosystem. The idea of capital as an autonomous force, a gateway between worlds, the shadow of an empire stirring in anonymous companies, smiling at closed cases. The sudden silence that descended for many years after the disappearance of the Soviet Union did not mean the end of this mysterious financial system. On the contrary, it was during this period that it acquired a new form, becoming even more sophisticated and incomprehensible to the outside observer. Now, it was not just a network of offshore companies and fictitious entities, but a truly living infrastructure within the global economy, managed by hidden hands whose names are known only to a select few. The people who created this machine understood that the sources of power lay in the ability to control capital flows outside official frameworks, and that the same logic that once allowed them to manage billions during the Cold War should also serve in the new digital era. With the advent of the 21st century, the entire world began to transition into the digital era, where transactions, data, and information became the primary assets. For most companies and even states, this meant transparency and accountability. But for the shadow network, nurtured in traditions of absolute secrecy, this was both a challenge and an opportunity. Possessing experience in circumventing control, its operators quickly mastered new tools: blockchain, cryptocurrencies, smart contracts, and decentralized platforms. This allowed them to hide capital even deeper, scatter assets across multiple jurisdictions, and remove them from the influence of banks and states. Now, transfers were not just anonymous, but turned into complex chains of exchanges of digital and traditional assets, mixed with works of art, jewelry, and even real estate. Such methods practically eliminated the possibility of unambiguous tracking, preserving the main principles: decentralization, anonymity, and security. Despite the revolutionary technologies, the basic principle of the shadow network remained the same. Each participant knows only a part of the picture, bypassing nodes without access to all the details. Even the highest leader of such a network could only see fragments and trust that the rest would be executed according to established schemes. Such a structure essentially became organic. It could eliminate threats, rebuild, and expand without changing its essence. Operations left no digital footprint, and personal contacts and encrypted transmissions gave way to multi-stage protocols where risks were distributed as evenly as possible. One of the most surprising features of this system was its invisibility to the public and professional investigations. Despite regular document leaks, journalistic investigations, and attempts to expose the schemes, the structure was not only not broken, but was able to adapt to the new requirements of cooperation between countries in the fight against money laundering. Using its years of connections and experience, it integrated into international legal mechanisms, finding loopholes in legislation and creating new complexities for control. Every attempt to reach the real beneficiaries encountered legal barriers, banking secrecy, confidentiality agreements, and the absence of a unified jurisdiction. Unraveling this network is like solving the most complex puzzle, where each detail is connected to dozens of others. Over time, the chains of companies changed, owners were re-registered, documents were destroyed or forged, and the story became increasingly convoluted. In some cases, investigators stumbled upon nominal directors, who were completely unknown individuals, officially working as janitors or couriers in distant countries, which led to dead ends and the closure of cases. This was not accidental. Such is the architecture of resilience. The absence of a single center and the fragmentation of information made the system virtually invulnerable. The internal mechanism of transferring powers and control resembles a secret fraternity. To gain access to assets, one had to prove complete loyalty and pass the test of time. Everything was based on trust in algorithms and strict discipline. The tightly knit network not only survived the change of eras and economic paradigms, but actively used every crisis to strengthen its position. Changes in government, Economic crises, international sanctions, all became reasons for redistribution and renewal of structures, but not for their destruction. Money ceased to be a simple resource, turning into a tool for survival and influence. Today, this system is no longer linked to a specific state, ideology, or personalities. It has become part of the global economic fabric. Investments in infrastructure in Asia and Africa, participation in European scientific and investment projects, funding of media and cultural organizations, all these are protective corridors for capital, which no longer belongs to anyone personally. Each such asset is a reminder of the centuries-old strategy of disappearance and camouflage. Legitimate enterprises have become mere facades, behind which lies a deep network capable of influencing global processes without unnecessary noise. Firms, funds, trusts, family offices, this is now the new language of communication for the system, allowing it to control trillions without the risk of disclosure. And the more digital transparency developed, the more impenetrable the mechanisms used by its operators became. Their methods are based on not leaving traces not only in financial documents, but also in the digital space, where management is divided among hundreds of participants, each seeing only a part of the information. This entire chain resembles a living organism, pumping blood, invisible and unassailable. Therefore, it is not surprising that even years after the disappearance of the Soviet Union and the collapse of the KGB, the system not only did not lose its strength, but became the foundation for the formation of a new Russian elite. Money, once invisible and inaccessible, has transformed into capital that controls networks of influence around the world. Their opaque origin continues to be a mystery, and attempts to expose the scheme are merely a game of cat and mouse with a system that is always one step ahead of any investigation. Today, the financial architecture laid down decades ago in a small Swiss office lives and develops, continuing to hold the world on threads that only a few are privy to know, and no one can see.